ultimately the goal. If you're going to have a large scale real estate business, is to bring on team members that take some of that off your plate. You figure out what you're good at, but in reality, as the owner or leader of especially a syndication business, probably the highest value thing that you can be doing is talking to investors.
Your network is your net worth. Come listen to some of the most successful people I know share invaluable knowledge, stories, and advice in real estate, business, and beyond. This is Weiss Advice. Whether you want to take your business or personal life to the next level, look no further. Welcome back to another episode of Weiss Advice. I am your host, Yonah Weiss. Grateful to be here today with another amazing guest. We got Jason Balara all the way from sunny California. What is going on? How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks, Yonah. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, sunny after the hurricane we just had. So we had about 48 hours of really kind of scary weather in certain parts. But yeah, now it's back to normal sunny Southern California.
Wow. Yeah. I remember when I was growing up in California, like in Southern California, there was this song on the radio, like it never rains in California, right? Another rains.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah, but that changed apparently recently.
Yeah.
So
half a year's worth of rain in like 6 hours. It was luckily, I think not as bad as it could have been, but yeah, it was an interesting experience for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'd love for you to give a little background to our listeners who may not be so familiar with who you are. Just take a minute to let us know, who is Dr. Jason Balara?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you just said, I am a doctor. I'm a veterinarian. I'm actually a veterinary surgeon, which I like to specify only because if people ask me questions about their pets that aren't related to surgery, I probably won't know the answer. So I'm happy to try, and I know other people in the industry. But I've been a veterinarian now since I graduated in 2004, became a surgeon. There's some additional training in 2008. And that's what I've been doing, sort of as my main career path since then. However, I've actually been in construction since I was a teenager. And so in reality, construction preceded becoming a veterinarian. And I've always used those skills within my own, like real estate investing on a small scale, right? Residential, my own stuff that all has a name now, like Burr and House Hack and Live and Flip. I was doing that mostly just because I didn't have money. So it was kind of a survival technique for me. I didn't know it had names. I don't know when exactly those things got assigned names.
It was pre-beer pockets. You were doing this.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, they really did sort of parallel, but like I said, on a small scale. And then about 3.5 years ago, what happened is we finished renovating our own house. I ran out of projects to do and was starting to look at, okay, how can I really get more serious on the investing side, on the real estate side? I also, at that point, my son was about 1 year old. So there were some important shifts in our lives, in my family. And it was coincidentally right before COVID happened, where this started to be in my mind. It wasn't because of COVID. I didn't have any great epiphany like a lot of people did when they got shut down, that they suddenly came up with these great ideas. But it was a little before COVID and moving into COVID that I really started to dig deep onto how I was going to become more of a serious real estate investor. I came across syndication through the Bigger Pockets podcast. Actually, I was just listening to a lot of podcasts, started finding those guests and listening to their other podcasts, and just really diving in with books, podcasts, anything I could do to learn more about syndication, because I hadn't been familiar with real estate at that scale. And it was very appealing for a number of reasons. Obviously, the scale is one, but the other thing is just I have always been, and I still struggle with this, but I've always been sort of that DIY guy. And syndication is a business. It forces you to be more of a CEO and an orchestrator and things like that. Nobody expects me to be the guy swinging the hammer on the renovations at our value add complexes. So it was something that, with our young son and my shift in kind of mindset towards the importance of time over working for money had a lot to do with all of it. So in the summer of 2020, I got a mentor. I did the mentorship with Ellie Perlman. That was kind of my first foray into it. She's amazing. And I sort of probably credit her for just about everything in my start. And I went through the steps, right? I did the education, I did the mentorship, I started doing the broker relationships. And so it took about a year before I got my first multifamily deal under contract. So during that year, we did do some things with our capital to try and just put it to use. We did some hard money lending for house flippers. We did a joint venture self-storage deal, like just trying to get in the game. I had been doing real estate at some level for, like I said, since I was a teenager. And so it was just kind of like, let's explore all the avenues, put our capital to work while we figure out this syndication thing and get a deal in place.
Right.
And so it was summer of 2021. That first syndication deal went under contract. Very shortly thereafter, we got a second one under contract. It's kind of that true thing. They say that the law of the first deal. If, funny enough, we hadn't closed it and it worked out that way. So closed the first two deals in December of 2021. Then the spring of 2022 was extremely busy, both on the asset management side and also, looking towards acquisitions as well. Closed another deal in July of 2022. And then that was right about the time when the market got crazy. And so there's been I had a deal, we can get into it if you want, but I had a deal fall apart. That was a big, I guess, moment in my real estate career. So there was probably about 6 to 9 months trying to get this deal salvaged and also licking my wounds when it fell apart, that didn't do much other than manage the assets that we have in terms of acquisitions. And then come spring of this year, I decided to not so much shift focus, but I did decide to create a fund. And the fund I really see as my way to bring my two worlds together. I had probably spent, the first couple of years of my real estate or syndication journey really kind of keeping everything separate. And the fund is called the Lark Veterinary Impact Fund. And so the idea is to bring the two worlds together through awareness. One is financial literacy and awareness for veterinarians. The other side of that is to understand awareness on people outside of the veterinary community, that there are a lot of struggles within the veterinary community. And we actually happen to have one of the highest suicide rates of all professions.
Wow.
So much so that there is a organization called Not One More Vet, which is completely designed to provide support, mental health and financial support for veterinarians. And so we've partnered with them as sort of a fundraising partner, and I'll be donating a percentage of the profits from the fund to Not One More Vet kind of on the back end. So to me, it was a way to, I guess, bring it all together and be, instead of trying to live almost two lives, I could put the two together and do that through impact.
Absolutely. And are you still, really my question was, how are you able to balance being a surgeon as well as, being an asset manager and running these properties? Are you still working full time in that, or have you scaled back?
I've scaled back. So up until that spring of 2022, I had a W-2 job. I also had I have a mobile surgery business, and then I was doing real estate. And the real estate was getting more and more busy, taking more and more time. I was doing phone calls and emails between surgeries and things like that. And so I actually left my W-2 job at June of 2022. So it was more of a time thing. And what I did was I still had my mobile surgery business and I had real estate. As you may, or the listeners may know, that the market did shift pretty significantly right then. And so it wasn't the best time to leave my W-2 job financially. I didn't know that going into it, but I had just, kind of run out of time. And so there have been some challenges. And that's, I think, people that want to get into real estate on a active role, it's important to know that these things can happen, that you can have market downturns, you can have challenges that you'll face, but ultimately it's very much a long-term game. So, we'll ride it out and we'll get to the other side and it'll be fine in the long run.
For sure. And listen, real estate is a long-term game, right? You're not getting into it to, obviously if you're just doing fix and flips, it's more short-term, but in the investing side, we're dealing with a much, 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 much long-term. And so yes, markets shift. You have to be aware of that. And hopefully you can come out on top. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of people already start to, falter a little bit, but we'll see where that takes us over the next, I guess, I don't know, we've been saying survive until 25, but we'll see how long it actually takes, the next 24 months or so, 18, 24 months. Tell me a little bit also about your company. You've named it Lark Capital, and I'm really always interested in the names and the meaning behind the names of people's companies. Because obviously it's not just something you didn't like, probably, I'm guessing you didn't like pick out a random name from like the dictionary or something, right? There's something behind that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a bird fan. Nothing against birds, but it's not bird related. It's actually, I love that question because you just mentioned, we talked about real estate is a long-term game, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, the long term is actually my kids. I'm not even thinking about what it means for me. I'm thinking about the future.
Right.
And so Lark is actually an acronym for Logan and Ava, LNA. Those are my kids. So the first two letters are their names, and then Reed, R is for Reed, my business partner, and K is for Casey, my wife. So this is it. There's no J in Lark. There's not a lot of words that J fits in easily, but at the same time, in a way, it's a little bit on purpose. I don't look at this all for me. It's something that I'm doing for, my family's future. So, and then conversely, our investors, right? You start off, okay, it's close to home. It's like, what can we do for ourselves financially? And then it's like, hey, wait a minute, we can help a lot of people. So I see it as this is a way to impact the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has a lot to do with your, the next question I have, which is you're also a podcast host, which is always great because I love having podcast guests who are hosts themselves. Not only do they have the right sound setup, right? So you know that it's going to be high quality sound, but you know that they have a little bit more experience with, just conversation and asking questions. And your podcast is called Know Your Why. And I think that's just so impactful, understanding that. And it's not something that everyone thinks about. And obviously people who have W-2s and who are just kind of in the hamster wheel, to give a veterinary kind of example, parable there, but people are in that and they don't know where they're going. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So tell us about the impetus behind launching that podcast and what that's about for you.
Well, like I said, when I first got into that early 2020, and I was like, I'm gonna really dig in on this. And I was doing so much, listening to so many podcasts, reading so many books. And it was interesting because there, in all of those places, there was always a little bit of a, what is your why? What, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Like I even think in Joe Fairless's book, which I consider sort of like the textbook of apartment syndication, I think there's a chapter or a section, right? Know your why. And what I found was that's what always resonated with me. That was what it's like, okay, anybody probably can learn the nuts and bolts, like the techniques behind it. But in order to survive these hard times, that's what really got me. You'd have people that would have come from a background of struggle, or maybe they went through some addiction or whatever, or they went through 2008 and lost all their money, that kind of thing. Like there's a lot of stories out there. And I think it's funny now I can look in hindsight and it's like, probably my early why, before I ever knew it was called that, was to just not be poor, because that's kind of how we grew up. So it was like, I don't want this. And I always saw ownership in real estate as the way to not be in that position, because as a child, we moved every year. Like we were kind of always on the move. And so it was something that stuck with me. And it's like, it's funny because I don't look back and think I had a bad or even a hard childhood. Like there were things, but those things that were happening, and in hindsight, you're like, oh, I don't want that for my kids. Right. It's kind of like, that was probably my early why. It was just, and the way I did that was by working all the time. I started working at a very early age, and always wanting to make sure that I had money, not just for me, but even then it was like for my family. This is a silly example, but this is going to date me a little bit, but I bought our family our first color TV. Like when I was a teenager, I got a job and I'm like, we're going to move from this old, terrible black and white TV. We're going to get this color TV. And so it was like, it's a silly thing and not important in what it was, but more important in like what it meant to me to be able to do that for my family. And so that was probably my early why, but I didn't know what to call it that. So maybe that's why listening to everybody's stories kind of, I guess that's what resonated with me. And so then I thought, okay, well, let's make a podcast that's about that. Like less about the nuts and bolts, because guess what? They can get that on everywhere, other podcast, right?
Exactly.
It's everywhere. Like they can talk to you about cost segregation on every podcast. And when you were on my podcast, I wanted to talk about your why, what's behind it. So it was just that's what came that's where it came from. And it's something that sticks with me. And it's cool to talk to guests about it because I find within myself and within my guests, there's an evolution of your why. You go from, kind of, I just don't want to be poor anymore to, can I change the world? And it's kind of a really cool transition to see.
And obviously it goes in stages, but I love that you're saying that there is a kind of a transition and evolution of our why and really of goals in general, because
exactly.
you have to have goals if you want to accomplish really anything. And I mean, you don't have to per se, but I think it's probably the right way to do it. And doing that, you end up discovering new whys and new things along the way that you never even knew were possible. You never even knew existed. I mean, think about it. Before you came across the Bigger Pockets podcast, right, going back 10 years ago, whatever it was, like you were living in your house and you're kind of doing your thing and fix it, but you didn't even know what investing was or real estate investing to that extent. And so once that world gets opened up to you, and then you find a mentor, you find the Joe Fairless best ever syndication book, you find a mentor, new worlds open up to you that you had never even knew existed before.
Yeah, absolutely. And it keeps going. It's like you meet more people, you make more connections. It's fascinating to see. It just opens up your eyes to what's possible.
Just going back to what you're talking about earlier, I had no idea that Ellie Perlman even had a mentorship program. So that's pretty cool.
She doesn't anymore. I think it was fairly short-lived, but I was lucky enough to get in that window, and I think it was invaluable. And I still consider her a mentor and someone that I can talk to and ask advice. She was one of the driving forces for the reason why I started the fund. She thought it was a good idea to start a fund, and I had to come to my why I would start a fund, beyond just doing that. But yeah, it was a lunch with her where the idea was put in my head.
That's awesome. And the fact that you're able to use that fund to then, like you were talking about earlier, combine, you kind of merge these two worlds of yours. There's obviously a challenge that a lot of people have who are in W-2s or in certain industry, and they transition into real estate and just kind of go full time and really almost forget about or leave behind everything that they had worked for. And for some people, that's actually the smart move. For some people, that's the right thing to do. I had someone recently on the podcast who was, in oil and gas for 10 years and talked about how the industry he was in was just, everyone was just in there for the money. And like, they're working long, crazy, intense hours. And that to me was like, okay, that's not so they didn't really have any bonding of any kind between the people. But when you have that kind of, community or that type of network, it's a great idea, especially if they are potentially, high net worth. It's obviously a good way to kind of merge or bridge that gap between that and not just kind of leave it by the wayside.
Yeah, absolutely. If the job or your past that you have is something that you want to escape, need to escape, great, do that. But it's not for me. I'm not unhappy being a surgeon. Like it's just, it is the main thing is it's like, I can't make money as a surgeon without doing surgery. And I can't do surgery without being in an OR. And I can't have my kids in the OR playing with me, so it's kind of like, it sounds simple, but really it is. It's like, what can I do? Here it's like, I can be on your podcast, record with you and go and take my kids to school. Like it's just a different feel as to how your life can be designed.
Absolutely. And it's really about designing that life for you. A lot of people let life happen to them and don't even think that they have an option. You're told to go to school and get good grades and, go to college or get a job or whatever it is. And it's like, that's it. You don't really think about the future and how you can have an impact and what you're going to do when you have kids. You're like, okay, I'll have kids and I'll put them in daycare and continue working. And that doesn't, sound so fulfilling. It seems like there's so much more. And when you have the opportunity, especially through real estate investing, when you can create more wealth, which can, design your life. And I was just reading recently, rereading, I should say, Who Not How. By the way, we've mentioned this book many times in the podcast, but if you haven't checked it out, we'll make sure to put a link in the show notes because it's such an incredible book. Dan Sullivan. And what he talks about there, one quote that just kind of resonated with me was, and I'm not sure who he said this in the name of, but if you have enough money, then you don't have a problem. And I don't remember, I'm probably not getting the quote right exactly, but essentially saying the idea is, we think we have all kinds of problems, but if you have enough money to solve that problem, then you don't have a problem. right? And that is the same idea of who, not how, is finding the right team members or finding people to do things for you that you don't have to actually take care of. And actually, many times, an investment. So I'm curious to know how you've kind of used that, because I know a lot of people have used that kind of concept to help scale their business.
Yeah. And I know that's one of the questions. And so you beat me to it on that, because that is like probably the most, I would say, like book wise for me in all the books I've read about real estate over the last few years, like that one has had the most impact in the sense that I told you, like, I am a DIY guy. Like I have our house, like I could build you a house. Like I know how to do this stuff. And so I did it, and I did it on our own houses. I did it on friends' houses and things like that. And it's like, but it's not the way to scale a business. And so the way that I've used it's funny because it's something that for whatever reason, I don't know if it was my veterinary mentors or what, but it has come very easy to me in the veterinary world. I very much feel I will teach my techs how to do something, and then I will trust them to do it well. And I don't try to and I actually think a lot of vets do struggle with this. I'm a mobile surgeon, so I go into clinics and I sometimes see vets that are like doing all of what I would say is a technician's job. And so I have some excellent technicians that I work with. And this is actually ties into your question of how do I do all the things?
Right.
In my surgery business, all I do is surgery. And I'm good at it, and I'm relatively fast. So the amount of time I spend is actually little in terms of hours to accomplish what we accomplish in that business, because I let my techs do essentially everything else.
Right.
In the real estate world, same idea. I have struggled with it a little bit more in terms of making that transition. You sort of bridge the gap with partnerships. I hired an assistant, funny enough, someone from the veterinary world who left the veterinary world to get into real estate. And then I ended up hiring her as my assistant in Lark. She's amazing. She runs the day-to-day. So all of the, like, example, like podcast outreach, she does a lot of the business side of things. And then we have recently brought in some VAs to help scale up our content production, like
marketing. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, stuff like that. I still haven't gotten to the point. I don't feel big enough, I guess, in real estate to have start hiring on the pieces that people do when they have, like, Ellie will have, she has asset managers, she has acquisition people, right. She has analysts, she has investor relations people. Like, that's ultimately the goal. If you're going to have a large scale real estate business, is to bring on team members that take some of that off your plate. Right. You figure out what you're good at, but in reality, as the owner or leader of especially a syndication business, probably the highest value thing that you can be doing is talking to investors. It's really probably the most important skill. And I fully believe that, despite the fact that I know that my strength is asset and construction management, and I am still uncomfortable talking to right. investors in a lot of instances. So that's something that I'm just spending a lot of time working on, is trying to get my comfort level and realizing that I need to be more of a forward-facing CEO. Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a really amazing point. Hunter Thompson in the Raise Masters, a group that I'm part of, that he talks a lot about this, is like, you are the CEO. You're the one who has to be in front of people regardless. I mean, yes, you can hire an investment relations manager, but in the end of the day, it's you that people are entrusting their money with. And so you have to, it's something you got to really just learn how to do. It's a skill and a talent that one needs to learn if you want to be very successful in the syndication business. Now, the syndication world itself has been a little bit tumultuous over the past few years. Obviously, a lot of people got in during the time that you got in, right? I mean, in fact, I mentioned this before, not long ago, but Ivan Barrett, who, a very, very successful property management company in Indianapolis, he was one of the first guests on Weiss Advice back over 3 years ago. And he said that, this was back in 2019, 2020, that there's not a real estate bubble. He said there's a syndication bubble. And that was, kind of humorous to me at the time, but I see it now more than ever because it's starting to pop. And there are people that are really, who went in for the fees and went in for, whatever they were doing, and unfortunately are getting a little bit burned right now.
Yeah.
So how are you dealing with that? I mean, you've obviously came in during that time. You bought, pretty quickly a few properties, and now how are you dealing with, just running them?
Yeah. On the asset management side, you have to get, I think what it's teaching everybody is that if it's not teaching you, you're probably going to fail, but it's teaching how to be a better operator. And the people that were already really good operators, they're going to be fine. And the people that are willing to take the hits and learn how to be excellent operators are going to be fine. The people that got on board because of that sort of bubble mentality and things like that are probably going to struggle. I don't wish that on anybody. On our side, what we're doing, we've paused distributions, which doesn't feel good in terms of what I want to be doing for my investors, but you have to preserve capital and make sure that you continue to operate the assets. We haven't done any capital calls, so there's a lot of that happening out there. But mainly what we've been doing is just looking at every line item, right? Every expense, every income item, like just what can we do to maximize it and maintain that, operations. And so I think it's just one of the biggest lessons I think I've learned through all of this is the debt. And I think it's probably one of the biggest lessons that a lot of people are learning through all this. The years prior to this market shift, the most common thing was bridge debt. I'm sure people who listen to your show regularly have probably heard about bridge debt, but essentially it's short-term debt. And especially early 2022, when there was a threat of interest rate changes, variable rate debt became popular. And so I know there are people that are in trouble because they have variable debt, but they don't have a rate cap. Fortunately, we have a rate cap on the one deal we have with variable debt. So it's just kind of like a little bit or a lot of learning lessons, but also just, what can I do right now to ride this out? Because as we said in the beginning, it's a long game. And so I actually had someone on my podcast I just interviewed, and he made a really great point. He's like, so if it's not a good time to sell our asset in year 3, guess what? We hold it for 2 more years and we sell it in year 5. If it's not a good time in year 5, we hold it for 2 more years and we sell it in year. So if you're not beholden to some short-term debt, you just hang on. And then, you wait till the market picks back up again, because it will. It's not like we're going to be in a 10-year recession. It's, the reason I think why people are saying survive to 25 is because that's like how long a recession lasts. And it's just kind of using history as a marker is kind of the guide. So I'm not sure that I answered your question specifically, because honestly, I think the list is incredibly long. I spend a lot more time as an accountant and a bookkeeper than I ever thought I would, just trying to figure out where we can save, fix things. You pivot your renovation scope of work, right? You say, well, we were going to do all these really nice renovations. Well, let's scale it back and hold on to some of that capital. So there's a number of different ways to approach it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, we talked about the long-term debt. That's going back to Joe Fairless's book. We mentioned this a few times, but he's got those 3 immutable principles of real estate, right? And one of them is get long-term debt, right? And I think a lot of people got really excited about the extremely low interest rates and didn't kind of think long-term enough that, this isn't going to last. It never has, and never, it never has lasted that long. You can't change those principles. The shiny object syndrome has really, really got a lot of people, unfortunately. And hopefully it won't hurt too many people, but I've already seen it hurt many. So I don't want to kind of dwell on that topic. And we are kind of running out of time here. So I do want to transition out what we call the final 4, Jason. These are 4 questions I asked to all my guests, and you know what they are. So we're just going to jump right in. The first question is, what's the worst job that you ever had?
It's funny, I'll tell you, I worked for 15 years for my uncle. He has a pressure washing company. So we pressure washed trucks, like big rigs, semis, outside in the winter in New England. Okay. That's not the worst job I've had. That's why I preface it. The worst job for me, I worked for the post office at Christmas time for 3 days. And it was such a down, gloomy environment where nobody seemed happy. It was terrible. There were breaks every 2 hours. It was just so different than anything I ever wanted to be a part of. It's the only job I've ever left and not come back. I went 3 nights and I was like, not worth the extra money. I can't do this. So to me, that was actually the worst job I've ever had.
Yeah. And that's a really good kind of, segue from the first thing you mentioned. But obviously something like that, you can't. I don't know how anyone does something like that. It just doesn't, it's very hard to function in an environment like that. Second question, what's a book you've read that's given you a paradigm shift?
Yeah. Well, we already talked about Who Not How, which I think is easily like the big one for me, and I'm still working on it. But I'll give you a second one just because we did talk about it. And it's David Green's Long Distance Investing book. And the reason I mentioned that one is because like early 2020, when I started thinking about how I was going to do this, I had no inclination that I could do it outside of my local market. And so though that book is about residential real estate, it gave me the idea that, hey, wait a minute, I live in LA. I don't have to do this here. So I would say those two books for me have been really pretty significant in, the directions that I've taken with this business.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually, I think one of the first real estate books that I ever read also was that Long Distance.
I've read it twice and listened to it on audiobook 2 or 3 times. Like at the beginning, I was just like, okay, he's doing this in other states. Like it just was like a thing that I had to wrap my head around because everything I'd always done had been very local to me.
Yeah, of course. Especially, you have the experience of the construction and the DIY. So it's like you have to be involved, right? You have to be on site. You have to be there. Yeah. And that's a huge paradigm shift when you realize that no, it doesn't have to be that way. Third question, what's a skill or talent that you would like to learn?
When I listen to your show, it's interesting. This question is probably the hardest of the 4, only because sometimes I listen to people who are like, oh, I want to be amazing at talking to people, or I want like these like life-changing skills. Right? But I'm like, I want to learn to play piano. That's my thing that I like. I keep saying like, I need to get time. I want to start taking lessons. We have a piano. My wife hates that I bought us a piano and nobody knows how to play, but like I plan on learning how to play piano and I plan on our kids learning how to play piano. But I think I love music and I think it's a beautiful instrument. And so I just have always wanted to be able to play piano. So maybe that's not a life-changing skill, but that's probably my truest answer to that question.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be life-changing. I mean, I think the important thing is that successful people are always constantly learning and constantly wanting to do new things. So that's a great question. Fourth and finally, what does success mean to you?
Being there for my family. I think it's just, really it's, yes, I look at it as, I want to have larger impact. I want to, like I said, I look at everything, kind of in the long term, and I want to change the world. I at very least want to make veterinary medicine better. I want to change those suicide statistics. I want to do good, but at the end of the day, I will feel successful to be able to be there for my family and let them, sort of lead by example and let them continue on the work as being impactful.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Wow, Jason, this has really been amazing. Love getting a little more into deeper into your story and your why, knowing that you have the podcast, know your why, and understanding it on this level has just been awesome. Where can our listeners find you or reach out to you if they want?
Yeah, they can email me, jason@larkcapital.com, or Instagram is @larkcapital, or LinkedIn is Jason Balara, Facebook, Jason Balara. And basically, you can search me on social media and find me. It's not hard. There's pretty much no other Balaras in the world. So if they're not related to me, it's an uncommon last name.
Okay. Well, I'm sure it makes it much easier for people to find you. So we'll make sure to put all that in the show notes as well. And I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Thanks so much. I'm wishing you the best of luck and much continued success.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you all for listening all the way to the end. Once again, you guys are awesome. We couldn't have this podcast without listeners. So keep it up. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and remember, until next time, the best advice comes only when you ask. Real quick, I have one question for you. Did you like this episode? If you did, I want to ask you a huge favor. See, the biggest thing that helps this podcast grow and that will spread this message to the whole world is that if you leave a review, a rating, and subscribe to the podcast. What that does is it basically tells the platforms that this podcast is out on is that you like my stuff and I'm doing something right. So take a few seconds out of your day, hit that subscribe button, leave a rating or review. I would be extremely grateful. Also, I want to hear from you guys. So I want to hear some feedback. If you have any questions for future episodes, please find me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM, a connection request, Yona Weiss, and I'd love to hear from you.